Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here again on the Made of Millions YouTube channel. My name is Teodora Pavkovic. I'm a psychotherapist, parenting coach, and an international speaker. And this is the second live series that I've been doing with Made of Millions. The topic of the first one was digital wellness, and you can find that here on the Made of Millions YouTube channel in case you would like to go back and look at some of the topics within digital wellness that I was talking about. That was a 5-part series, same as this one. With this one, I'm talking about a slightly different topic, although I think it's quite closely related, and that's positive psychology. And so today we are in episode 4. It's hard to believe that we only have one more left before we wrap up this series. And today I'll be talking about optimism. And I think the timing now probably couldn't be better to not just talk about optimism and the importance of having optimism in our life. Thank you for those of you who are saying hi. Hi, Anne. So not just the importance of really having optimism, but just really being clear on what optimism is, on how we can define it, how we can describe it. As some of you know who've seen me speak before, I'm very focused on emotional intelligence and how we can use emotional intelligence and awareness and more emotional literacy in our everyday lives. So one of the questions that's really interesting for me is, what does optimism feel like? It's really important that we know what these kind of different states feel like in order for us to be able to implement them on a daily basis. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We start off a little bit later today, but we should be wrapping up within about 30 minutes or 35 minutes. Hi, Emma. If anybody would like to ask a question, please feel free to leave it in the chat box. You can also see all the contact details there, both for myself and the Made of Millions Foundation. So in case you would like to get in touch, ask for any additional resources or really anything else that you feel like, you can feel free to reach out to us. One final thing that I wanted to say is that the month of May is slowly wrapping up. I'm wearing my green ribbon here to signify the fact that it's Mental Health Awareness Month, and the Made of Millions Foundation has been doing some really wonderful things to raise awareness and to reduce the stigma around mental health issues. So one of the kind of the initiatives that they've employed over this month of May is the No One Told Me initiative. And I don't want to spend too much time telling you about it this morning with our live series episode, but I do encourage you to look up Made of Millions on Instagram or Facebook, to look at the website and have a look at the No One Told Me initiative that I've taken part in as well myself. But I just kind of wanted to mention that at the onset, and also to mention the fact that if any of you are struggling with mental health issues, of course, as a psychotherapist and a coach, I would really recommend that in the first instance, you at least reach out to somebody who you know and somebody who you trust, whether it's a family friend, a sibling, somebody in the family, a family member who you trust, and then if that doesn't quite help and you still feel all the things that you're feeling, to then of course reach out to a trained professional. Okay, so let's get started with that. Let me change my view first. Again, if you have any questions as I'm speaking, please leave them in the chat box. I won't be seeing that until I'm done presenting my slides to you. So I want to start off by talking about what optimism is usually seen as. And if you've been following the other episodes that I've been presenting here, you've probably seen me use some of the cartoon work of the Awkward Yeti, and I just really love his stuff because I just think it kind of illustrates these very common everyday kind of human behaviors so nicely and so simply as well. So you can see here the heart running towards, or seemingly running towards, reality, and then seeming to kind of change direction very quickly and go hand in hand with anything else. And so usually this is the way optimism is conceptualized, and typically kind of throughout history, we've had this very black and white perception of what optimism means. Oftentimes it's been perceived as this kind of wearing of rose-colored or rose-tinted glasses, and seeing everything around us in a much better way, or as a much better version of what it actually is. And so one of the kind of the most famous quotes that I think really embodies that kind of attitude comes from an Eastern European author. Some would consider him to be a philosopher as well, Milan Kundera, who said that optimism is the opium of the people. So it's this idea of kind of fooling ourselves and tricking ourselves and masking what is real, masking what is true around us, and putting on these rose-tinted glasses and having this very unrealistic perception of what is going on around us, and kind of missing the actual truth, the actual difficulty, the actual weight of reality. And of course, if you're watching this live in the midst of this global pandemic and this quarantine, this physical distancing, then you know just how heavy our reality is right now. I prefer to think of optimism in a slightly different way, and of course, my attitude towards it is informed by positive psychology. But I also wanted to share this quote with you by Noam Chomsky, who I think really captures what optimism should be seen as. And what he says is that optimism is a strategy for making a better future, because unless you believe that the future can be better, you're unlikely to step up and take responsibility for making it so. And there are a couple of things from his quote that I want to highlight that I think are actually very profound, and that I think we should actually be focusing on when we talk about optimism. There are three things, actually. First is that optimism is a strategy. What that means is that there are certain things that we can do in order to employ this strategy, employ optimism, and practice it on a daily basis. There are certain steps we can take. There are certain ways of thinking about it. There are certain ways of defining what it is, which then makes it really easy for us to apply that every single day. The other two things are the idea of what we believe in and the kind of taking responsibility and stepping up. So actually doing something about it. So it's this combination of what we believe in and what we do that I think is really, really crucial to optimism. And the father of positive psychology, of whom I've spoken over these past 3 episodes, Martin Seligman would definitely agree with this as well in terms of how he has defined and positioned optimism. And he also combines these ideas of what we believe in, what we think, and what we actually do. And the way he talks about optimism is as the goal really being that we're doing well, what we're actually doing, how we're performing in life, and that then feeling good is a delicious byproduct of doing well. And this is one of the books that I've actually recommended to you guys over the first 2 episodes. It's called The Optimistic Child. Of course, as the name suggests, it has been written for older children who can read this as well, but for parents in particular, in order to help them help their children become more optimistic. But because he talks so much about optimism and defines it and describes it and talks about what are the steps that we can take to actually become a lot more optimistic and a lot more positive in terms of our outlook, I think it's a really good book for anybody to read. And so what he talks about in that book is this kind of emphasis that we've normally placed on how we feel, that is the most important thing, that is the goal that should lead us through life. He sees that as leaving us feeling kind of pretty empty, and sometimes potentially even leading us to feeling very depressed. And I've talked about this in my previous episodes, that when you make happiness kind of the ultimate goal or the ultimate point of what you're trying to do, you will usually miss the mark. And so what he talks about when he talks about optimism is that doing well, the actions that we take and feeling good about those actions is what leads us to feeling good in a more global sense. And that leads us to being a lot more optimistic as well. And so going to those beliefs before we move into to what we can actually kind of do about it. There are a couple of different ideas that I want to share with you that I would like for you to either take a mental note of or write them down somewhere and kind of carry that with you over the next couple of days and draw your attention back to these concepts. The first one being that the glass is refillable. And I really love that concept. And I wish I knew who came up with it. I tried to find the kind of the original creator of this idea, but I wasn't able to online. But the idea that the glass isn't half full and it's not half empty, which is usually how we talk about it, but the idea that it is refillable. So meaning that even if you do kind of use up some of your resources and you use up some of your positivity and you use up some of your kind of mental and emotional stamina and your resilience, you can still do things in order to refill that glass. And there are a couple of things in particular, three things really, that I think are incredibly important when it comes to our beliefs and how we conceptualize our well-being and our optimism. The first one is to do with failure. And this is where Martin Seligman's work on optimism is really important, because he really helps us kind of redefine and reorient ourselves towards failure and how we think about failure and what we do post failure, which is incredibly important. So that's the first thing that can really help us think of our glass as being refillable, and it can help us build up a little bit more optimism. Number two is frustration, meaning our ability to tolerate frustration. And again, if you're watching this live in the midst of being quarantined for who knows how long, in this case, having probably been physically distancing from the people you care about for a long time, we're all experiencing incredibly high levels of frustration. And a recent survey that was conducted at Yale University actually indicated that there are only a few emotions that are kind of top of mind for people right now, that they're experiencing more so than any other emotion. And those were things like anxiety and stress and frustration. And so a lot of us are experiencing these emotional states right now. And probably nobody taught us in school when we were younger, in our homes, how to tolerate frustration better. We don't tend to get a lot of lessons on that, unfortunately, as we're growing up. That is one of the most important skills that we need to develop in order to become more optimistic and more resilient, and really think of our glass as being refillable, of really thinking about this as being something that we can help ourselves with. So now is the perfect time to really train ourselves. And I think a lot of people have been doing that, which makes me feel incredibly optimistic. But practicing how to tolerate higher and higher levels of frustration while staying relatively calm. One way that I like to think about it is if you've ever swum in a not just an ocean, but in a swimming pool as well, any body of water that is particularly cold. Usually it's very hard to just jump in suddenly. Some of you may be able to do that. I personally can't. And so there's a kind of gradual getting used to that temperature that you need to go through in order to finally be able to make that plunge. So I like to think about frustration tolerance as that. And I like to use that image with children as well when we're trying to explain what it means really to tolerate our very, very difficult emotions. And so tolerating frustration, kind of elevating our level of tolerance for very, very difficult, very heavy feelings such as anxiety, such as stress, such as frustration itself, is incredibly important. The third point is really to have a very good sense of what our purpose is. Having a firm purpose, being persistent, being consistent, and kind of not giving up. And this, some of you may be familiar with this concept of grit, which has been talked about and written about quite a lot over the past few years. Angela Duckworth has written a book about that, and has, again, herself done extensive trainings and has spoken a lot about this idea of having grit. And there are different ways of defining it, but the kind of essential idea behind it is that you really stay true to what your purpose is. You hold your purpose very firmly, and you're able to persevere. You're able to carry your goals through a number of different obstacles. And so the idea of resilience plays in that as well. And so these are really the kind of the three ideas that I would like you to walk away with today. This idea of redefining failure, or reorienting ourselves towards how we understand failure and what we do about it after it's happened. The second idea is to really be able to tolerate our frustration a lot better, to be able to tolerate higher levels of frustration. And the final one is to really be able to hold on to our sense of purpose. To be able to persevere. So these are the three things that feed into this idea of being able to refill our glass, being able to refill our resilience, stores really when they're running a little bit low, and they feed into this idea of being optimistic. They are all different components of optimism. And so the first one that I was talking about there that I'd like to talk to you about a little bit more right now is this idea of failure. And as I was saying before, for me, being a psychotherapist and a parenting coach, having this background in psychology, feelings are really the most interesting thing for me. They're the kind of the biggest guiding principle in everything I do. All the interventions that I share with my clients is, how do we feel about things? We have to know how we feel first, and then we need to look at, do we need to shift the way we feel about something? Do we need to shift our emotional state around something? And I think when it comes to practicing optimism, what we're really doing is, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is we're shifting our emotional and our mental states around what failure feels like and what it actually means. And as I was saying, one of the most important kind of contributions that Martin Seligman has made when it comes to optimism is really giving us an idea of what we can do kind of post failure. And that really helps us to shift how we feel about our failures and what we think about them as well. And I think when it comes to the emotional component, I really love this image, and it's an image I often use when I talk about self-compassion, because I think it beautifully illustrates that emotional shift that needs to happen in terms of how we experience our failures. And I think that is what is going to increase our levels of optimism. Again, it's not wearing those rose-tinted glasses, and it's not by pretending that everything is going to be okay if we know that it's not. But in terms of shifting our emotional state and how we feel about when things don't go too well, I think the most important thing that we need is a really, really good dose of self-compassion. And this image, I think, reflects that beautifully, because it conveys a certain sense of lightness and a certain sense of softness. And whenever we're in very kind of high anxiety, high stress states, like what we're all dealing with right now, there's a huge amount of heaviness and a weight and a kind of burden that just makes it very difficult to function, and it makes it very difficult to be optimistic. But if we try to embody this slightly kind of softer, more flexible, more lighter, more kinder kind of an approach to ourselves and to what is going on in the world, it can really help us to elevate those levels of optimism. And what is also important to remember, as I'm kind of describing to you what optimism is as opposed to what it isn't, is that optimism, which is what kind of Noam Chomsky mentioned as well, it is to an extent a future-oriented mental state. It is having a kind of hope and faith that's not blind, and that isn't about, I'll just cross my fingers and close my eyes and just kind of hope for the best. It is really about doing all of these, kind of taking these actionable steps that I'm mentioning to you to make sure that you have the strength and that you have the ability and the skill to persevere and to tolerate frustration and to reorient yourself towards failure in order to be able to then tell yourself, I'm not totally sure that everything is going to be okay, but I know that I'm going to do the absolute best that I can, either by myself or by asking for help and looking for resources outside in order to make sure that I do the absolute best that I possibly can. And this is where self-compassion comes in, and it's so incredibly important that we have it, especially during these times. Once we start losing compassion for ourselves and for other people, our levels of empathy and understanding go down as well, which can be possibly the most dangerous thing or the most dangerous kind of emotional and mental state to be in during these times. I'm sure none of us have gone through exactly the same thing in our lives before. This is the very first time for all of us. But these kinds of incredible global hardships are times when we really need that compassion and that empathy and that optimism more than ever. And of course, this is not something that we just kind of engage in ourselves in the privacy of our own apartments or own rooms. These are emotional and mental states that we want to share with other people. And so for those of you who are watching us live, I encourage you to take these ideas with you and to share them with at least one other person today and tell them a little bit about kind of what you saw in this presentation and what you learned, and maybe help somebody else elevate their levels of optimism as well. But the final component that I want to talk to you about when it comes to optimism is this reorienting ourselves towards towards our failures, in terms of how do we kind of mentally, cognitively conceptualize what failure actually means once it happens. And again, like I said, Martin Seligman has given us this kind of series of steps that we can take in terms of reassessing the situation after we have failed, in order to get a much more realistic view of what actually happened, and get a much more realistic view on these three elements. The first element is the idea of permanence of whatever it is that happened, that we're not crazy about and that didn't go too well. Do we have this idea of this only happens sometimes in a very limited kind of a capacity, or do we tend to kind of expand the negativity there and say things like, I always make mistakes, or I'm always clumsy, or I'm never focused, I never am able to pay attention. Those are some of the kind of the trigger words that I would recommend that you look out for. So things like I said, I always make mistakes, or I'm never good. The always, never, those absolute words go into this concept of how permanent we believe that failure is. And what the research has shown is that when we do tend to have that belief that we are never good, or that we are always making mistakes, or that we are always bad, we're much more likely to suffer from the different elements of depression and potentially even become clinically depressed at some point down the line. So that's permanence, the sometimes versus always. Pervasiveness, how much of our life do we believe is affected by whatever it is that happens? And so it's this difference between having a very global view of, for example, having spilled tea that morning and saying, that's it, my whole day is ruined, it's over, as opposed to having a very, very specific kind of understanding of it, or a belief about it, saying, well, I may have ruined kind of the next 10 minutes because I spilled this tea and now I have to clean it up and I potentially have to change my shirt. But it's certainly not true that my whole day has been ruined because of this one very specific thing. So again, the importance of being very, very specific in terms of how we view our mistakes or our failures. That is something that's really been highlighted in a lot of this research that's been done by Dr. Martin Seligman and others, in terms of how our beliefs and our perceptions of failure can impact how we feel about ourselves as well. So the second one is pervasiveness. The final one is personalization. And personalization answers that question of who is to blame, really, for what happened, who or whose fault was it? And I'm sure all of you know that there are some people who will tend to always blame other people for when things go wrong, and there are other people who constantly blame themselves and who think everything is their fault, and they're purely the ones to blame. So this is where it's also important to be very realistic. Again, optimism is about realism, to be very specific about taking responsibility and whose responsibility it actually was, and to really be able to distinguish and define the difference between, that spilling of the tea wasn't my neighbor's fault, because at that point, they did whatever it was that they did that then impacted me spilling my tea. This was something that I did in the moment because I was clumsy in that moment and I wasn't really paying attention because I was thinking about something else. But this isn't something that I do all the time, and this isn't something that's going to ruin my whole day. And this isn't something that I'm going to blame myself for excessively. It's just a very specific moment in time, and then I'm going to kind of move past it and persevere in whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish for that day. It's also, of course, important that we don't excessively blame ourselves. Again, this is what the research indicates can also potentially lead to depressive states and even clinical depression at some point down the line, so that it's very important that we can recognize when other people are responsible for their own actions or for their own behavior, that it wasn't us who made them do anything. So in terms of adjusting our mental states, these are the three ideas that I wanted to share with you that come from this extensive research that Dr. Martin Seligman has conducted. He calls that the explanatory style. So what is your explanatory style? How do you explain what happened when it happens, when it's something that was a mistake or that was a failure, or something that you weren't really a fan of? How do you explain them based on their permanence, their pervasiveness, and their personalization. So it's the 3 Ps that are relatively easy to remember. But these ideas I would also encourage you to walk away with after this presentation, and to have a little think about the next time that something doesn't go quite right. What is that internal monologue that's going on inside of your head in terms of how you're thinking about whatever it is that happened? Because of course that will impact how you are feeling as well. And so to slowly wrap up and to kind of give you one sort of core idea that I would like you to take away from this and to walk away with, goes back to the quote that I shared with you from Noam Chomsky at the beginning, where he defines optimism as a strategy. And I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about optimism, because like I said at the beginning, it gives us very clear definitions in terms of what it is. It gives us a perspective shift, which is one of the reasons why I love positive psychology so much. I think that does this, and it does that in so many different areas of our lives. It gives us a perspective shift in terms of how we can look at our own sense of strength, our own sense of resilience. It also gives us another option for how we can feel about things that don't go right in our everyday lives. And it also gives us options in terms of how we think about failure and how we conceptualize it, in terms of how we take responsibility for it, how we view it in kind of the greater scheme of things, and so many other things. So again, if you weren't able to catch all of the things that I talked about today, I think a little bit of note taking was probably a good idea today. This video is going to be available on the Made of Millions YouTube channel just as soon as we wrap up here. So I do encourage you to go back and look at some of those ideas in terms of the 3 Ps of the explanatory style, and also the ways in which we can reorient ourselves towards failure, elevate our levels of frustration, and how we can really firm up our sense of purpose as well. And of course, I hope that those will be helpful to you, especially during these really difficult times that we're going through right now, with physically distancing ourselves from our loved ones, quarantine, health issues, work issues, and everything else that is going on today. Thank you, Stacy, so much for your comment. I'm glad this was helpful to you. I've given you a whole list of ways here that you can stay in touch with both myself and the Made of Millions Foundation. Like I said, we're coming towards the end of Mental Health Awareness Month. Made of Millions is a wonderful mental health advocacy group and foundation. So I would really encourage you to have a look at their website. Like I said at the beginning, they've been doing a few initiatives over the past month that are really meant to support people and reduce the stigma around what mental health is and how we talk about mental health and how we share it with other people. And I think this also feeds into this idea of optimism and how important it is to really understand what mistakes or failures are about, what failures are and what they're not, and how we orient ourselves towards them. A lot of people view having issues with their mental wellness as failures and as huge mistakes. And part of what Made of Millions is doing is really trying to eradicate that form of thinking. And again, trying to infuse a lot of compassion for other people and for ourselves when it comes to this conversation around mental health. So if you have any other questions about what I talked about today, if you would like any additional resources, please feel free to reach out to me. You can send me an email. If you would like some more resources around positive psychology, I would encourage you to have a look at episodes 1 and 2, where on one of the slides I shared a whole list of books and websites that you can go to where you can find some more information about positive psychology. You can find the VIA Character Strengths Survey, which is a really wonderful free survey that you can take. There's a youth version as well that will show you what your list of strengths are. And this is a really wonderful thing to do as well when we think back on how Martin Seligman defines optimism in terms of doing well, how important it is to do well. One of the best ways in which we can do well in life is to really be aware of what our strengths are, and then use them in very intentional, very conscious, very, very purposeful ways on a daily basis with ourselves, but with the people around us as well. So with that, we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining me today. Next week, we're going to be talking about resilience. I mentioned it a few times today, but if you would like to know a little bit more about that topic, about what resilience is, again, how we define it, how we can use more resilience in our life and increase the amounts of resilience for both ourselves and our children, then I encourage you to join me same time and same place next week. So on the Made of Millions YouTube channel at 10 a.m. Eastern Time.